82nd anniversary of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant accident in Japan, the Caldicott Foundation and Physicians for Social Responsibility held a symposium in Manhattan on the medical and ecological consequences of the Fukushima accident. We pulled out figures from that symposium for you to listen to. This is information that, unfortunately, you will not be getting on the evening news, but you will right now from WVVH television. The sort of myth is that Fukushima happened, it's past, and the consequences are not catastrophic. What's the situation at Fukushima, Kevin?
Well, actually, the catastrophe is still unfolding. There's still radioactive releases from the site on an ongoing basis. There's leaks, especially from the water cooling systems that are leaking into the ocean. The radioactive fallout onto the mountainsides and onto the surrounding countryside are washing into the ocean from natural precipitation. The groundwater is actually leaching radioactivity from the site into the ocean. And it's worse than that, actually. There have been exposés of the so-called cleanup practices of the surrounding regions, the surrounding prefectures, where cleanup crews who are being paid handsomely to do this work are simply dumping radioactively contaminated materials into rivers to be washed out to sea. Of course, some of that's going to settle in the sediments of the rivers, in the fish that people may be eating. There's another tragic development in Japan where radioactively contaminated rubble is being incinerated all over the country. And there are not filters in place to catch the radioactivity before it is re-emitted into the atmosphere. So this accident, this disaster, this catastrophe, just like at Chernobyl, is ongoing when you're talking about half-lives of cesium-137 and strontium-90 of 30 years. You got to multiply by at least 10. That's 300 years of hazard associated with just those two radioactive poisons. So it's ongoing. Of course, we're not out of the woods yet either. What has happened has been catastrophic for Japan, for the world. But we are looking at a house of cards at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 4. It was damaged by the earthquake, by the tsunami, by a massive explosion. And that building is listing. There are bulges in the walls. There are 135 tons of high-level radioactive waste in that storage pool. And if that building collapses in another large earthquake, 7.0 is given as something to worry about. A worrying thing is when the Japanese minister visited the site many months ago, he said that this building is solid, it's strong, it could survive a 6.0 earthquake. People aren't talking about a 6.0. What if another big earthquake hits that site and the building collapses and the cooling water supply is lost? That 135 tons of high-level radioactive waste could catch on fire in a short period of time. There's no radiological containment over it. In fact, it's open air at this point. That radioactive release would dwarf what's happened thus far, because that's a lot of high-level radioactive waste. As much as 100% of the radioactive cesium-137 could escape in that fire. We're talking about an order of magnitude larger release of radioactivity than what's already occurred thus far in the last 2 years.
In terms of thus far, if there isn't more in the way of disaster, what do you think will be the consequences in terms of loss of life in Japan and elsewhere, wherever else the radioactive poisons went?
Well, I'd have to, refer to the real experts in these matters, people like Dr. Alexey Yablokov from Moscow, who is an expert on Chernobyl's consequences. And Dr. Yablokov has a shocking figure in his analysis of close to 1 million deaths. And that's only from 1986 to 2004 in the former Soviet Union. So he made a startling statement shortly after the beginning of the Fukushima catastrophe. He visited Washington, D.C. as part of the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl commemoration, and he spoke at the National Press Club. And he pointed out that the large-scale releases at Fukushima, which were still underway at large scale at that time in April of 2011, were unprecedented in terms of the population densities of northeastern Japan. And so when you expose that many people to those kind of radiation dose rates, that's real trouble. And there's already worrying signs. It's not clear what it exactly means, but a third of the children in Fukushima Prefecture have nodules and cysts on their thyroids. And so there's questions remaining. Is it because we're looking that we're finding these things that may have been there before Fukushima at those rates? But chances are this is a very bad sign. At Chernobyl, the thyroid pathology was off the charts. I mean, where there was a single case of thyroid pathology in children in Belarus per year, that shot up to many hundreds of cases. It's an undeniable consequence of the Chernobyl catastrophe. It had a lot to do with the Soviet cover-up. They did not tell people that there was an accident for days until Sweden outed them. They did not distribute potassium iodide pills to protect people's thyroid glands, especially vulnerable children. And in a country like Poland, which was not under the influence of the Soviet Union at that point, the Polish government immediately, as soon as they learned 3 days into the catastrophe that there was radioactive iodine in the air, on the grass, cows eating the grass, in the milk supply, they did a potassium iodide distribution. There is no thyroid epidemic in Poland, but there very much is in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia. So that's one of the ones to watch for in Japan. It's due to the vicious radioactive poison, radioactive iodine-131, which, granted, has a short half-life of 8 days, a short hazardous persistence of 80 or 160 days. But during that time period, it does tremendous damage to thyroids that are exposed to it.
You went, Kevin, to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant complex before the catastrophe, before the tsunami and the meltdowns, and you issued a warning. What happened in your trip? Were you listened to?
I was on a national speaking tour of Japan, and my first stop after Tokyo was Fukushima Daiichi, the two host towns, Okuma and Futaba. And I met with the mayors and the vice mayors and the nuclear regulators. They listened politely, but they disagreed with my warnings about such things as the risks of storing high-level radioactive waste in vulnerable pools at a place like Fukushima Daiichi. I had a public presentation that evening where 100 people came from the surrounding area. Many of them had long sought the closure of this nuclear power plant because of risks from earthquakes and tsunamis that had been warned about for a long time. And we had lunch at a local organic cafe that had just opened a year earlier, and it was a very, cozy and vibrant place, a mile down the road from the front entrance of Fukushima Daiichi. All of the people I met are now nuclear refugees that number altogether well over 100,000, more like 150,000 nuclear refugees who have been removed by government order from a 12.4-mile radius around the rubbleized reactors. But that exclusion zone should extend much deeper into Fukushima Prefecture. There are hotspots in Fukushima City, 50 miles away. There are hotspots of radioactivity in southwestern Tokyo, nearly 200 miles away. Close to 10% of the Japanese landmass received fallout from the Fukushima catastrophe. So, it's shocking to have been there 7 months earlier. It's a beautiful place. I stood on a bluff looking over the Pacific Ocean, and 3.5 miles to my north, very visible, was Fukushima Daiichi with 6 reactors. 3.5 miles to my south was Fukushima Daini with 4 reactors. What's little known is that Daini survived this catastrophe by a single off-site power line. There were more operating reactors at Daini. There were 4 operating reactors at Daini that day than at Daiichi, where there were 3. So several off-site power lines were lost to the earthquake. The emergency diesel generators at Daini were lost to the tsunami. And thanks to one off-site power line, 4 reactors were saved from meltdown, and even a bigger radioactive release than at Fukushima Daiichi. And this is the scenario that yesterday Prime Minister Khan at the beginning of the symposium warned about, and also his chief cabinet spokesman Adano admitted to on the first anniversary of this catastrophe, that they were worried about what they referred to as a demonic chain reaction of atomic reactor meltdowns and pool fires at these 2 nuclear power plants, and another one closer to Tokyo called Tokai, which has 1 reactor and 1 pool. You add it all up, 6 reactors at Daiichi, 7 pools at Daiichi, 4 reactors and 4 pools at Daini, 1 reactor and 1 pool at Tokai. Metropolitan Tokyo would have had to have been evacuated, over 30 million people, and they were actually making plans in case this unfolded, because it very well could have. And ironically enough, the great Japanese filmmaker Kurosawa envisioned such a catastrophe in his film Dreams in 1990. There was a vignette called Mount Fuji in Red, and the way it was depicted was atomic reactors exploding behind Mount Fuji as seen from Tokyo. And he captured it. It's what could have happened, what partially did happen at Daiichi, what could have been so much worse, but what has happened is already so catastrophic.
What do you think should be done regarding the nuclear plants in Japan, a little over 50, and the nuclear plants around the world? There's nearly 500.
They need to be shut down before they melt down. As we've seen at Daiichi, these reactors, they're high-level radioactive waste storage. These are accidents just waiting to happen, whether it's a natural disaster that takes out the power grid and the emergency diesel generators. That could easily happen at a place like Indian Point, which is vulnerable, perhaps the most vulnerable atomic reactors in this country to earthquake risks, because they were so poorly built in ignorance that there were fault lines immediately adjacent to them that went unidentified. So the plant wasn't very strongly built. And granted, we have San Onofre and Diablo Canyon on the California coast next to the San Andreas, but at least they knew the San Andreas was there. They built them a bit stronger, not strong enough. But at a place like Indian Point, a not so strong earthquake or a strong earthquake that they never thought possible could devastate that plant. And of course, you've got 21 million people within a 50-mile radius of Indian Point. So emergency evacuation is an impossibility in any short period of time. So the exposures would be off the charts. I mean, Ed Lyman at Union of Concerned Scientists a decade ago warned about a successful terrorist attack at Indian Point causing just unimaginable casualties, 44,000 radiation poisoning deaths, 500,000 latent cancer fatalities, $1 trillion or $2 trillion in property damages within a 100-mile radius. That's off the charts. And Arnie Gunderson, during his presentation here at the symposium, made a great point to conclude his presentation about Fukushima Daiichi with an image of Tokyo at night showing how big the city is. And he asked, when is it that a technology capable of such catastrophe is just too much to accept? When does such a technology become untenable? Well, we're there. Indian Point's 40 years old. It might not take a natural disaster or a terrorist attack. A lot of these plants are houses of cards ready to have a major breakdown. It's called the breakdown phase, and Dave Lochbaum at Union of Concerned Scientists has long warned about the increased risks of age-degraded reactors.
And Indian Point is 30 miles north of New York City.
And it's run by perhaps the worst nuclear utility in the United States called Entergy Nuclear, based in New Orleans. But it gobbled up reactors cheap and is now running them into the ground, postponing major safety repairs, apparently to boost the executive salaries of its company and also shareholder returns. And they're taking huge risks. It's a game of radioactive Russian roulette with these old reactors.
There's a myth, there's a kind of spin that not many people died as a result of Fukushima or will die. The catastrophe happened, but somehow we dodged the bullet. What do you think of that?
No, we don't. It's garbage. I mean, it takes a long time for the medical implications to arise from people who've been exposed to radiation. Already we're seeing in 100,000 children who've been examined by ultrasound, their thyroids have about 42%, which is nearly 50%, have abnormalities like cysts and nodules. 3 children have been diagnosed with cancer. 7 more are suspected of having thyroid cancer, and this is 2 years. We didn't see any thyroid cancer in Chernobyl for 5 years. So that indicates to me as a paediatrician, these kids got a really high dose of radioactive iodine and cesium, which goes to the thyroid. We don't know about leukemia yet. The Japanese government and the medical organisations are not keeping decent records to show if there's increased incidence of infections, or in fact babies are getting leukemia in the first few months of life after they've been exposed to radiation in utero. So it's very hard to extrapolate. All you can do is say, look, these are the ground measurements. 10 million people are still living in highly radioactive areas, many of whom are children. Children are very sensitive to radiation, 10 or 20 times more than adults. And so we're just waiting. We're sitting on a medical pathological time bomb.
Why did you organize this conference on the second anniversary of Fukushima? Because others responsible to look into these sort of things are not?
I organised it because I was so incredibly frustrated by the media's response to Fukushima. They, in fact, do not understand radiation biology. They don't understand the latent period of carcinogenesis, incubation time for cancer. And I was extremely annoyed with them, so I thought I'll set this conference up to educate the media. And if you educate the media, then they can educate the public. And as Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. So I'm teaching, and it's kind of a medical school weekend for, well, it's not the weekend, it's Monday and Tuesday, for people to learn about the medical effects of radiation and the nuclear accidents. That's why I did it.
What do you want media to communicate on these,
Well, it's a very complex issue, Karl. You know, it's taken 2 days to get through many of the subjects that need to be addressed, so I can't just say in a couple of sentences what I want the media to communicate. Rather, I want them to have a bit of an in-depth knowledge of what these accidents mean and what it means to eat radioactive food and radioactive fish, how long the radiation lasts, like 300 years once the land's contaminated. How long is it lasting in Europe? 300 years. And at least 40% of the European landmass is radioactive, which means much of their food will be, because food concentrates radiation. So I wanted them to, and I want them to read my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. If they read that, they'll understand a hell of a lot that they just simply do not understand. So I'm fed up with the Murdoch press and the superficiality and the trivial stuff that the media report. This is a fact, an issue of life and death, and it's an issue too about the genetic ramifications for the rest of time. In other words, there'll be many mutations that cause deformities and genetic disease. There are now 2,600 genetic diseases described. I'm a carrier of one of them, actually, because one of my children has just been diagnosed with a genetic disease. But as we increase the background radiation and we get radiation in our testicles and ovaries, so we will increase the incidence of genetic disease for the rest of time. So people understand, if we don't all die from global warming, which is kind of a distinct possibility now, or a sudden nuclear war, which is also a distinct possibility, and no one looks at that, we're producing random compulsory genetic engineering for the rest of life and destroying the very building blocks of life. Rest of time, destroying building blocks of life, not just for humans, but animals and plants.
Do you have hope that this horrific path that we're on can be, we can move from it?
Well, of course we can if we have the guts to do it. I led a movement in America. I'm an alien, I'm a female. I was only about 40, I think, and led the movement against the nuclear weapons freeze. And we, with doctors, mobilised 80% of Americans to oppose the concept of nuclear war. When I started 5 years previously, most Americans said it's better to be dead than red, we should have a nuclear war. And I thought this is a psychotic nation, so I educated them. So, in fact, one person, if they've got the passion for life in their soul, can in fact lead a nation to sanity and survival. And we've got 3 issues. We have to close down all the reactors, 104 in this country. We don't know what to do with the waste and never will. We have to abolish nuclear weapons, and Obama needs our help with that. And we have to stop burning coal right now, and we have to stop fracking, and we have to fill the nation up with solar panels, windmills, and the Americans can conserve 28% of the electricity they currently waste by leaving all the lights on, and nuclear power only produces 20%. They should never use their clothes dryers again, but hang their clothes outside in the sun in the summer and buy the furnace in the basement in the winter.
Lucas, you're the editor of Enformable, a very important website internationally on nuclear news. Now, it's been 2 years since the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster, but if you look at all mainstream media, it would seem that nothing much happened.
No, they've definitely done a very good job of regurgitating the same small amount of information and really downplaying the key details that have come out in the last 2 years. And I think that what we have seen is a direct attack on any attempt to not downplay the issue or to highlight some of the key details that I think the future generations and key policy experts really need to be paying attention to coming out of this disaster.
What's behind what some people are calling the Fukushima Cover-Up?
I think you're seeing a lot of political currency being put behind it. I think that you're seeing a lot of reputations are on the line over this because you have 50 years here in America of repeated attempts to manipulate and persuade the public that, number one, nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors are two completely separate entities and do not involve themselves in the same conversation. That, I think, was really destroyed by the Fukushima disaster, which released infinite times more energy release than from the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bombings. At the same time, we are also starting to see the ways in which the politics and the lack of credible science has been manipulating, sorry to use that word again, but also leading the way that we put policies and legislations which govern the nuclear industry as well as our nuclear weapons complex.
What should we know about the impacts, the consequences of Fukushima, which, in fact, we're not being told?
The first thing I think you should know is that they're unknown. And at this point, they're unknowable with the data that we have. Anyone that I believe tries to make a definitive statement to downplay or mitigate the risk is really doing so at a risk of their professional reputation. Because if you don't have the data, then any attempt to say that there is no risk is based on an opinion that could be just the same as an errant guess or a dart thrown at a dartboard. Without that data that we have not been released by TEPCO or by the Japanese government, even the United States government here with our EPA RadNet system, then I see that as a very big professional liability.
In terms of the impacts beyond Japan, there were impacts here in the United States. I mean, there was a dispersion of radioactivity, and some of it came in the winds to this country. But then there was this very mysterious shutdown of some of the monitoring stations in this country a few months after the accident. Could you elaborate on like what happened and what you think it all means?
Well, when we look at the releases, you have the aerial release, you have the aqueous release into the ocean, you also have the deposition from the aerial release, which most of it was released onto the ocean. One of my main concerns then is with the tsunami debris. You have top-floating debris, which is moving at a slow rate of speed across the ocean in the primary path of deposition where the most radioactive materials fall out. Yet, even though these are ionized materials, which are not going to be washed off by ocean wave activity, we have representatives and state officials here in the United States who are downplaying the potential contamination and radioactivity in the tsunami debris. That's one thing that we're very concerned about. Secondly, with regards to the RadNet, I think we really found out how inadequate and broken that system is. And this is the way that they talk about it internally within the NRC and EPA. They recognize the fact that this system was not meant to detect the iodine that because the delay in time between collecting the samples and analyzing the samples allowed the majority of the shorter-lived isotopes to decay beyond our ability to accurately detect where they were when they were passing over or being deposited on lands outside of Japan.
Now, this is the current administration, the Obama administration, involved in, well, 3 months after the accident began, the monitoring stations all over the United States, which had been monitoring the stuff coming here, well, on a daily basis, suddenly went to not a daily basis anymore.
And you really want to look at the Obama ties with the nuclear industry. You have to go back to his time in Illinois, which is one of the largest nuclear producers in its own state. If it was its own nation, last I saw, it would be the 6th largest nuclear producing nation in the world. You have multiple facilities, even the Zion facility, which is being decommissioned slowly. And I think that we are seeing the fact that our elected officials, without public pressure being put on them to maintain the standards and the integrity that we elected them to, are very much swayed and moved by the nuclear industry and the influence that they exert.
What about Japan? For a while there, we had a government in Japan led by a prime minister who said, this is unacceptable, this is intolerable, we must close down all the nuclear plants in Japan and go on the path. And in fact, Germany went on after Fukushima. Let's go to safe, clean, renewable energy, wind and solar and so forth. But then, after a while, another prime minister took office who is for nuclear power, wants to reopen all, 53 nuclear power plants in Japan? Like, what went down, what is going down in Japan?
Well, I think a lot of those policies and that changes that we are seeing is directly from pressure being put on outside of Japan or by the nuclear industry itself, which in Japan they call the nuclear village. The people of Japan, the citizens, are staunchly against these new proposed measures. They celebrated when Japan passed their no nuclear in the future policies, and they are now attempting to, they're still protesting. They're still showing up every day at the Diet. I think we're seeing a larger divide between our elected officials around the world in nuclear countries and between the constituents which they represent.
Kazko, how do you feel about what's happened to your home country, Japan, as a result of this Fukushima Daiichi catastrophe?
I just feel so sorry, and I was so disappointed with my own government. And I feel so sorry for the people who have to leave their homes behind, and those people still in a refugee, in exile. And there are, I think, 160 or 70,000 people in exile.
The prime minister at the time that the disaster occurred, he then moved to shut down all the nuclear plants in Japan. But then another prime minister was elected, and he's for reopening the nuclear plants. What's happened in Japan? Why? I mean, the people seem to be against nuclear power in Japan. What happened?
Yeah, people are against, but the government is supported by your government, and your government want it running.
My government, the U.S. government, wants nuclear power.
Or U.S. government or U.S. businesses.
How did this other prime minister get elected if the people were for shutting down the nuclear plants and against nuclear plants?
Oh, the former administration did too terribly, first of all. And then there's a rumor about fraudulent election, like Bush election you had before. Very similar thing happened in Japan.
What do you think is going to happen in terms of this 53 nuclear plants in Japan right now as we speak? All but 2 have been shut down. Do you think that they're going to end up to be reopened?
Well, if they keep the current administration, yes, that is the case. But, the economy is just diving, I think. So probably the people in Japan will elect another administration. That's what I'm hoping for. And then the current will change a little bit toward anti-nuclear movement.
Does Japan need nuclear power?
No, not at all. We saw a video message from Mr. Koide of Kyoto University.
At this conference?
Yes, in the beginning. And he told we don't need any nuclear power. Well, actually, the last summer, we didn't have any nuclear power generation. But we didn't have any power problem at all.
and you have plenty of wind, and there's plenty of sun, in fact, in Japan. And there are ways to generate energy, apparently, in Japan without the nuclear power plants.
Yes, that's what we are hoping for.
Now, you're from a city which is on the edge of the radiation zone.
Yes.
Do you fear for your family and the people you know all through your life?
Actually, the contamination level is quite low, like 50 becquerel per kilogram. But unfortunately, my parents' house has 500 becquerel per kilogram right now. It's about as contaminated as in Tokyo. And
Tokyo?
Yes, Tokyo is very contaminated. Oh, yes.
From Fukushima, we don't hear much about that.
Many people left Tokyo already, and I'm going to present two ladies during the lunchtime, and they left Tokyo after 3/11. And even in my hometown, which is not that contaminated, but I feel sick. And last year, about this time, my nose kept bleeding, so I have to really leave that place. And I sought a refugee in Singapore.
Singapore?
Yes. Why Singapore? Because the minister, Edano, kept saying to us after 3/11, there is no immediate health effect, and which we all believed. And at that time, his family was in Singapore.
No immediate, but you just
Yes,
wait a few
right.
months, a few years.
Yes, yes. So I thought Singapore was perfectly safe. And so I went to Singapore, and after 3 days, my nose stopped bleeding.
Dr. Alexey Yablokov is among the most renowned scientists. He's a biologist in Russia, and he has studied very carefully the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear plant accident with a team of other European scientists. And Alexey, you concluded in your analysis, your report, based on a study of medical data now available from 1986, the year of the accident, to 2004, that there were 985,000, near a million, excess deaths attributable to Chernobyl.
Look, the problem is, how I catch this data, how it's possible to calculate. We have to compare population which living in contaminated area and in clean, so-called clean area. The same ethnic, the same economy, the same, only difference is the radiation. And when we conduct such a study, it's not my own study. The study was based on famous mathematician and epidemiologist from St. Petersburg, Professor Hudoley. They compare 6 provinces, heavy contaminated provinces in Russia, after Chernobyl, with 6 near surrounding, not so heavy contaminated. Vital statistics. They have data from 15 years after Chernobyl. They calculate based on official statistics, based on regular normal data, which is published, and it's possible to check it every year. It happened that during 15 years, this territory, this heavy contaminated territory, have level of mortality for up to 4%. No, exactly 3.75, about 4%. After this, it was published small brochure. After this, I try to catch the similar data from Belarus and Ukraine. I was surprised that the same level of differences mortality, additional mortality, for 15, for 20 years, 4%, 5%, 3% additional mortality. When So we have tool, we have scientific tool now. It's possible to calculate what original calculation from Hudalay paper. It was about 250,000 differences between these 6 provinces. When I apply this data for the same level contamination territory outside Russia, for Belarus, for Ukraine, and for Europe. But by the way, it need to remind that bulk of radionuclide from Chernobyl going outside of Soviet Union. Only 42 or 43% of radionuclide struck the Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. All other going away. Where? Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, even North Africa, even some part of Asia, even some part of North America, United States. But so it's possible to calculate amount of radionuclide and what connected with additional deaths. Of course, not such a level like a heavy contaminated Russian area, but it's possible. No, let us suppose that it's 10 times less contamination, 10 times less mortality because better medication. So. Such I received such a number between 800,000 to maybe 1 million additional deaths during 20 years.
You've been very critical, Dr. Yablokov, of the International Atomic Energy Agency that was created by the United Nations. It's supposed to protect us from, well, things like Fukushima. It's supposed to not only protect us, but if there is an accident, with some scientific honesty, go in and tell us what's happened. But you have described the IAEA as a handmaiden of the nuclear industry. I mean, what's the situation with this international would-be protector of people around the world and nuclear power?
Nuclear power is one of the, maybe not one, maybe the most dangerous way to produce energy at home. Even everyday operation gives some small amount of radioactivity, which may be some unhealthy consequences. Of course, if you compare coal industry, coal and nuclear, for everyday operation, coal is dirty. Coal create much bigger number of lung cases and so on. So, but if you combine such data like Three Mile Island, Sellafield, Fukushima, Chernobyl, and so, it's impossible to compare because it's nuclear industry is the dirtiest industry which we know. Why it happened? Because why government support nuclear industry? Because nuclear bomb. Because nuclear industry is not only nuclear energy, it primary it nuclear bomb. Nuclear energy, nuclear power plant is the tail of nuclear bomb. It was historical fact. It was just now a situation may be changed because now country which want to have nuclear bomb to officially declare that they want to construct nuclear power plant. But it means that they have possibility. They step. They going to inevitably going to the direction of nuclear weaponry.
Mary, what's your big concern about the Fukushima disaster?
Well, new findings that have come out really just since 2005 that women and children, we knew children, but female children in particular, in the 0 to 5 age group are twice as likely to come up with cancer after a radiation exposure than little boys in the same age group with the same level of exposure. So there is a hidden damage that has been ongoing everywhere that there's ionizing radiation exposure. But at Fukushima, now we know this thanks to the numbers that were published by the National Academy of Sciences in the biological effects of ionizing radiation. Report number 7 in the series. There's a lot of limitations to that report, but I don't think we should just completely dismiss something like a 100% increase in radiation incidence between the two genders. That's enormous in terms of the possible outcomes and consequences and what kinds of policy decisions we should be making to protect children, all children, but especially little girls.
Some nuclear physicists argue that a little bit of radiation doesn't hurt. In fact, there's some nuclear physicists, and they have a name for this theory, it's called hormesis, who say that a little bit of radiation is good for you. It exercises the immune system. Is there a level at which it's okay to absorb radioactivity, radiation?
Well, in fact, there is no safe dose, and the National Academy of Science has held this view consistently through 7 reports. The Environmental Protection Agency of the United States states in the clean water standards and the safe drinking water standards that there is no safe dose of radiation. It's reflected in the assumptions of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the as low as reasonably achievable policies even state that we need to reduce all the way down to 0 to have 0 risk. So the way I put it is that no, we do not see cancer or harm from every single radiation dose. Our bodies are amazing. We have repair mechanisms. However, it's a numbers game, and the more times you have to repair, the more times you're likely to screw up and have a problem, like the overall thing that's studied is cancer, but there's many non-cancer effects of radiation. But all it takes is a single emission from a radioactive nucleus of an atom hitting a cell and damaging it in a particular way, probably under any number of particular ways, to set in motion the process that becomes cancer. It can be a dose so small that you cannot measure it, and yet fatal cancer is a possible outcome. So no, there is no safe dose of radiation.
The impacts, the consequences of the Fukushima catastrophe, how do you see them?
A nuclear event, a disaster, a catastrophe has a beginning. It was March 11th with an enormous earthquake and tsunami of 2011 in Fukushima. It has no end. The consequences of the events that unfolded from that day will not end on this planet. It is not only a human body burden, we each have our lifespan. It will be an intergenerational population body burden in that area, and really a planetary scar that you'll be able to pick up for the next many, many, many millennia. There is no end to the Fukushima event.
And beyond the borders of Japan as well.
And beyond the borders of Japan as well, although it begins to mix, although scientists who are studying water contamination are able to ID where the particular cesium comes from. Did it come from atmospheric nuclear weapons tests? Did it come from Chernobyl? Did it come from Fukushima? They are able to actually fingerprint it. It's very interesting that our level of detection is getting that fine. So yes, the massive amount of contamination into the Pacific Ocean, as well as the land in Japan, and atmospheric contamination that went around the globe repeatedly. We can track the Chernobyl cloud back in '86 for 10 days, circled the Earth 4 times at measurable levels that were easy to detect. And it's still mixing in. We still are breathing contamination from Chernobyl today.
David Freeman has been a giant in terms of energy policy in the United States, chairman of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Quite a critic of nuclear power, might I note. In fact, what you did at the TVA was try to cause a turnaround. Now, the Fukushima disaster, how do you see that in the context of your decades of work in energy?
Well, it's just another confirmation that anything that can go wrong will over time, and it's just another huge reminder that we now know how to make electricity in ways that don't pose those kind of dangers, like using the sun and the wind and storage, and that we shouldn't be building new or continuing to operate old plants that are capable of destroying a good chunk of our country, as well as contaminating millions and millions of people. But I don't really know that that lesson is learnable by a population that's into avoidance behavior and that gets so much propaganda from the nuclear industry and the federal government that is supporting nuclear power. So that my own views these days are to emphasize that we have something better than nuclear power, namely that we now know how to harness the sun and the wind and get our electricity from benign sources. But it's still a very tough battle, and you have to be optimistic. The only way I stay optimistic is that I look at where we were 30 years ago when you could get everybody talking about this subject into a telephone booth and not fill it up very much. So at least we're more aware of the problems that we face, and the technology for a solution is advanced. What I fear is that the so-called small bunch of anti-nuclear advocates are still focusing on the anti-nuclear side, when I think we should be focusing on the idea that we have a cheaper and better alternative now. We didn't 30 years ago.
Those alternatives, led by wind and solar power, can they power our society?
Well, they are. You know, the interesting thing is that the Tennessee Valley Authority that I ran in the 70s, before World War II, was 100% renewable. It's entirely the hydropower from the dams that were built. And in California today, we now have gone to 20% renewable. The law requires that we get to 33% by 2020, and the Governor Brown is talking about 40%. The revolution is underway. It's just a tiny fire right now. It needs to be fanned, and people need to know the technology is there, and the costs are down to the point where, on a life cycle basis, they're lower than nuclear or coal, for that matter. But the advocates seem to like to talk more about what's wrong with nuclear than what's right about solar.
On nuclear, however, I mean, if it's not necessary, if solar and wind and geothermal and hydro and
storage, we have to make storage a paying partner, because the common sense of people is that, you know, the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't blow all the time, so they tend to dismiss it. But if you throw storage into the picture, and we do know how to store the solar power and use it when we need it, and the same with the wind power, either in batteries or compressed air or pumped storage plants, we know how to store it. And we are not doing a good enough job of explaining to the American people that we do have a full, complete, reliable alternative that doesn't pose the dangers of the bomb. And we ought to start calling this stuff atomic power, which brings to people's mind the bomb rather than nuclear, which sounds kind of vague and uncertain.
with those available today, safe, clean, renewable energy technologies, like what's behind the nuclear push then, which continues?
It's a cult. People have a religious belief in nuclear power. I will talk about that this afternoon. It started with Harry Truman, who, when he first learned about the capabilities of the bomb, said, we got to make a blessing out of this awful thing. And it's been America's almost indefinite guilt trip that we've been on. And believe me, it's a very powerful thought process of making something good out of something bad. After all, it was the bomb was born in the United States of America, and we dropped it. And so rather than having a post-war debate about whether that was right or wrong, we went into a euphoric discussion of the wonders of that awesome power. There were even religious songs about this is the force of God Almighty. and people believed that this had to be a force to be marshaled for the good of mankind, and that was a theme song in the late 40s and early 50s that I'm going to talk about this afternoon. There wasn't anybody in America that was opposed to it, including the Sierra Club, by the way.
Guilt and or greed. I mean, considering the big companies, GE and Westinghouse wanting to make a buck, or the national nuclear laboratories trying to perpetuate themselves.
But you're compressing history.
Okay.
It started off with the huge guilt trip. The greed came later when it was commercialized in the 60s. But in the beginning, believe me, as a young engineer in the 1950s, I applied for TVA's nuclear program because it was considered the most exciting. It was the future. It was the alternative source of power. We called it that, just like solar is called today. It was the alternative to dirty, nasty coal. And nobody even focused on the safety problems. They were just all brushed aside in the euphoria of making something good out of something evil. I just don't know that I can convey to you the enormity of the enthusiasm. I mean, Dwight David Eisenhower, the President of the United States, who was very popular, went before the United Nations on December 8th, I think in 1953 or 4, and proclaimed atoms for peace. And Glenn Seaborg went around to 60 different countries selling the idea. This was America's response to having dropped the bomb.
Glenn Seaborg, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, ultimately a discoverer of plutonium back in 1942, which was used in the Nagasaki bombs and most bombs since. Now, Dave Freeman, what changed your mind personally about nuclear power?
I think the thing that changed it the most, I was skeptical of it when I was at TVA, but I have to be honest, I closed those nuclear plants down because they cost too much. I mean, it was a hard thing to do. I mean, I was concerned about the safety, but I was not, an anti-nuclear person. But I saw after 3 Mile Island that the costs were just out of control, and we shut them down to keep the rates from going up. And there was in the back of my mind a lingering concern. But what really got to me was when in 1991 when I visited Chernobyl. And I saw a monument dedicated to dead villages, not people, villages, and went out into that desecrated zone on a Saturday afternoon and spoke to a group of people, and tears came to their eyes when I spoke about solar power. And where a person I was staying with, I handed him my Geiger counter. He's living in Kiev. It's 5 years later. He said, I've been in fear of my life every day for the last 5 years. At least now I will be able to count the radioactivity and know what it is or not. It brought home that we had really wiped out a huge portion of the Ukraine forever. The old people who used to live there could no longer live there. I mean, there's an old expression that seeing is believing. And I do think that seeing is believing. And there's no one that could go to Fukushima now and come back and not be skeptical of nuclear power. And, I can remember when I first took over TVA, truly there were about 3 people that did bumper stickers saying save energy, and that was the whole ball game. When I left, we had $300 million of energy efficiency loans outstanding. And that has gained. Efficiency's now given more respect than ever. Solar is virtually economic, and so is wind. What we just need to do is inspire the younger people to grab this baton and make it a movement again.
Dr. Goto, how has the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster affected Japan?
Yeah, it's affected a lot, and 2 years passed, and from yesterday, and but is many evacuees and still suffering from the evacuees still living the outside of Fukushima, and also the many people have to stay inside of Fukushima, worrying about radiation dose.
There are how many people roughly are within that zone where they're living in a contaminated area right near the Fukushima plants.
Yes, the government say that 20 microsievert per year, they draw the line, and so then the government say that they have to evacuate that zone, but there's a many hot spot outside that evacuation zone, and also the middle the area of the Fukushima as some place highly contaminated, but nobody care about their contamination.
Nobody cares?
Yes, this means that the government say that it's okay to come back to Fukushima because radiation, those contamination is lesser than before. But the lesser than before is not mean is lesser than before the accident.
Now, the Prime Minister at the time of the accident, he, after this disaster, said, we don't want nuclear power in Japan. We want to shut down all the nuclear plants in Japan and embark on using safe, clean energy, not nuclear power. But now you have a Prime Minister who has kind of reversed that, and he's for nuclear power. What happened in Japan?
I'm very ashamed that, we have a lot of movement against the nuclear power plants and after the 311. But unfortunately, the economic was so bad, and so new Prime Minister say that, and so we try to rebuild the Japan, and so many the people like that kind of the statement. The tragedy, and also everyone wants a safety environment, but the meanings is a very different, and maybe the big companies and new Prime Minister, and they want to keep the country strong. The strong means they have to keep the nuclear power plants, and because we have to keep once we have to have a nuclear plants, we have a chance to build the nuclear weapon.
Nuclear weapon? You think nuclear power is related to nuclear weapons in Japan?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. So this is a kind of the wishes the new Prime Minister. Because the new Prime Minister want to change the constitution, and the constitution says that we have to keep the peace, no weapon, and no nuclear power. And also we have many standards about nuclear weapons. But yesterday and recently, and he announced that he wants to change that kind of standard.
So you, after World War II, as part of the end of the war, the Japanese military committed itself to only defense and ultimately promised that Japan, or the Japanese government promised that no nuclear weapons would, but now apparently there's in the wind a change in that.
Yes. Yeah, he wants to change not only constitution but also the standard, no nuclear weapons.
And a drive for nuclear weapons in Japan, you feel, might be behind or is behind the renewed push to have nuclear power in Japan.
Yes.
Thank you for watching and listening to some very, very scary stuff. Information about nuclear power, about Fukushima, about the abundance of safe, clean, renewable energy sources that could easily substitute for nuclear power. This has been Karl Grossman reporting for WVVH-TV from Manhattan. Thanks for watching.